Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Marguerite. Thank you, Keith. And thank you all for being here this evening. I'm a grateful member of Al-Anon. My name is Louis, and I'm also a Cairn alum. I went to Cairn Breakthrough Program in July of 1985, and I went to the Substance Abuse Treatment Center, and at the time it was called Chit Chat, in August of 1985. And I owe my life and the fact that I can even sit here today and talk to you entirely to Cairn, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful. This is so the least I can do to give back to all that Cairn has given me. I'm just very, very grateful. So tonight's discussion is on boundaries. And before I get into my discussion, what I want to do is kind of give a little bit of background to frame the discussion, and the two key points that I want to underscore that are going to be prominent, and I think you'll see throughout the entire talk, are kind of an underlying theme. And one is that boundaries are hard. It is really hard to define and enforce boundaries, period. That's been my experience. The other thing is that love is unconditional, but relationships have limits. And there's a really important distinction between the two, and I'll get into what all this means in my discussion. My background is I grew up in an alcoholic family. My father was alcoholic. My mother was an untreated compulsive overeater. I became a drug addict and an alcoholic at age 11. At age 21, I came into Al-Anon. And at age 22, I got sober and went to Cairn, and have been in AA ever since. I got married when I was 11 years sober, and I adopted 2 children when I was 19 years sober. Both have gone through Cairn, and both, by the grace of God, are sober today. So I'm going to focus my discussion on boundaries in my experience with my 2 sons and what I went through. So what is a boundary? Okay. Webster's defines a boundary as something that indicates or fixes a limit. It's a limitation. And personal boundaries are physical and or emotional limits that people set for themselves as a way to safeguard their overall well-being. Healthy boundaries help people define who they are as a way to ensure relationships are safe, supportive, and respectful. Unhealthy boundaries are thoughts and behaviors that are used as a means to manipulate or control relationships to keep people away. So a good way to think about all this, I got a quote from Raquel Lerner, which I thought was very insightful about this, is what I value, I will protect. What you value, I will respect. And that is the nature of what a boundary is. Boundaries can be principles that influence behavior on both parties. There is a boundary definition. There are 2 parts to it, a definition and then the enforcement. Now, the definition can come unilaterally, or it can come through a negotiation, or it can come through a force of events. But what it is in and of itself is one thing. The enforcement of it is something altogether very different. And both are critically important. The other thing I've learned also is when a boundary is defined, it's important to understand the context at which it was defined and the context at which it is being enforced. And I found that boundaries that are too rigid can create challenges and difficulties, and boundaries that are too loose can also create challenges and difficulties. So the dance of boundaries essentially is having one that's effective enough, but also is reasonable enough that it would drive value to both parties involved. So a boundary is only good as it is enforced. And the experience is that if it's not enforced, subsequent boundaries with the same parties can be harder to define or enforce. So in other words, if I don't enforce a boundary, and I've been through a lot of this with my kids, I got walked all over because I tried to put a boundary up and it lost its credibility. And I lost a certain degree of credibility in myself. And so why are boundaries important? Okay. Healthy boundaries foster agency, individual agency, where the individual is able to make decisions on their own and of their own free will. People with agency act independently to make their own choices. In recovery, having agency means taking an active role in healing to improve your life. And you take actions to move from a life of addiction to one of recovery. And so not only is my own recovery about my own agency, but my own agency gets much greater enriched the degree to which I allow others to have their own agency. And boundaries are a critical part of that. So the agency is around decisions one makes, and the goals one set for their own recovery is their own. The less I get involved in my son's recovery, the better. It's none of my business how they maintain and seek their sobriety. Boundaries empower this as they clarify roles and responsibilities in a relationship. And this is a really important thing, that boundaries are something that are predictable. So if something happens, okay, I know how I need to respond to a particular circumstance because that's already been determined by the boundary. So there's a certain degree of stability in the experience and a certain degree of predictability in the experience with a healthy boundary. Because ultimately, my sons make whatever choices they make. And so the most important thing I can do is not get involved in how they make their decisions, how they assess things. What I can do is when they ask me, I can give them suggestions. I can give them certain ideas. But if I try to manipulate them or get them to get to a specific decision, then I'm overtaking a boundary and manipulating them to an idea that I think is better than how they're looking at it. Okay, so it's an empowerment situation, and I need to allow my sons to make their choices, because the challenge of that is that it involves a great deal of ambiguity, and that I may not get results that I think are right, or I may not understand the results I receive from them. But the boundary in and of itself gives me an assurance to some degree or other that things are going the way that they're supposed to be going. And that's another reason why they're critically important as well. So let me tell you my story, my journey into boundaries with my kids. We decided to adopt our two sons internationally. They both come from Guatemala. And we went through, you go through a certain amount of training and discussion with the agency about what to expect and what you should be doing as parents, and some of the issues you address in an adoptive setting, particularly international adoption, which is a little bit different than domestic adoption. So we went through all of that. And we certainly recognize, I mean, these kids are they're being literally let go of by their moms, that there'd be issues, all right? But my wife and I had no shortage of love or willingness to do any of this, so we felt very strongly that the love we had for them would be enough to help them overcome any sense of trauma, any sense of emptiness, any sense of challenges that they would face in being an adoptive kid. They were very, very young when they came to the United States. So the whole issue around linguistic, assimilation and all this stuff really wasn't there. Okay, so they pretty much were raised. They knew about their adoption from the very beginning. They were very lovingly raised by us as our children. And by their own admission, they had a very, very happy childhood. We gave them everything that we could as a reflection of our love, and we loved them dearly as children. Once they hit into their adolescence, okay, a lot of this stuff started coming up. And it turns out that my two sons also had learning disabilities, and they're also children of color. So they had challenges assimilating and connecting with their peer group. And what ended up happening was COVID. And they had been experimenting with drugs and alcohol prior to COVID. But once COVID hit, they jumped off the deep end. And their active addiction was triggered. And it got really, really bad. And what ended up happening is that we tried putting boundaries. We tried to set limitations to them. And one of the challenges that we faced was, as a parent, okay, you go through so much of these kids' lives and you're greatly influencing or telling them what to do because they're kids, And once you get into this adolescence phase, there's a very important but natural shift that comes in with those ages. Unfortunately, because they were doing drugs and alcohol, that adjustment, we were incapable of making that kind of adjustment because everything went haywire. And we tried to do boundaries with them, and they just blew right through them. And it got bad. And it got so bad that our family blew up, and cars were totaled, school issues. I mean, you name it, we experienced it, and it was horrific. And in that process, one of the things that I learned in program, and this is one of the things that's so invaluable about Al-Anon and the support I got from people in recovery who'd been through this kind of stuff, and the unconditional love that was there, was I recognized that in this situation with my kids, the worst thing I could do is make it be a part of me, make it be about me. Okay, so I needed to practice the steps, work the spiritual hygiene that is Al-Anon, and continue to focus my work there and present to my children a stable force in their lives, a stable adult force in their lives, and present to them a place of safety so that they could feel their pain in a different manner, that I could invite them to that. It took me quite a while to get to that place, but that's the place that I landed to be able to then get into a place of discernment, to be able to understand where my kids were, what they needed to do, and what was the next step. Because we tried everything. We thought that for quite a while that, because of their adoption, learning disabilities, adjustment issues, and all the stuff in their adolescence, that the substance abuse was something that they were doing to try to cope with all that. It took us a while to get to a place where we recognized that what they had was actually addiction, and that, these other factors were real, they absolutely were going on, but that wasn't driving the show. Addiction what was driving everything, and it took us a while to get there. And so what was critically important is during that period of chaos and confusion and all that, I maintained a sense of equanimity and peace inside as best I could. And it eventually, and I was communicating constantly, my wife and I were communicating constantly, and it took us a period of time before we both got on the right side of the table, and we both had a clear understanding that it was addiction. And then the first real boundary was set in an intervention. We sat down with them and said, you either go into treatment or you are on your own. You will no longer be living with us, period. And that was a little over 2 years ago. And one of my sons went to Karen, and my other son went to Ashley. And one of my sons has maintained his sobriety throughout this entire time, and he's doing great. My other son has spent, he slipped a lot during this 2-year period of time. And this is where boundaries come in. So the one son that has the 2 years recognized early on that he was not welcome home. He was not to come home under any circumstances, and that he was not to use. And that if he were to use, he'd be on his own. And so that propelled him to continue to his treatment, and he's been able to maintain sobriety. My other son, what was happening is he went to an array of different treatment centers, and in each treatment, what he would do when he'd go out is he'd go out for one day. So one of the times he went out is he drank hand sanitizer. So he drank hand sanitizer, and that evening called us up and said, I drank hand sanitizer. And the treatment center kept him. And so we went through this cycle a few times, and we got him to a couple of treatment centers. And then we finally got him to Renaissance in Florida. And what happened when he went to Florida was we said to him, this is the last house on the block. We got you down here to Florida because the weather is better if you're living on the street than it would be if you were in Maryland. So it's your choice. If you want our support, if you want our, if you want us to be able to have a kind of life where you're getting treatment and all that, we're behind you 100%. You maintain your sobriety. We will do whatever we can to support your recovery. If you want to pick up and use, you were on your own, and in all likelihood, because you don't have a job right now, you'll probably be on the street. And the therapist there that was with him had him do an exercise to write out what would life be like if you were living on the street. And he wrote it all out. Excuse the language, it scared the daylights out of him. And he's been sober longer than the entire time since he's been in treatment. And he has surrendered. Okay. So he came back to us and said that boundary made it very clear to him that he had a choice to make, and it was his choice. And that's what's so important about boundaries, is that these are the principles. You make your choice, you live with the consequences. And that's what's so important about this. That's why agency is so critically important. We basically said these are the choices you have, and this is what you got to deal with. And very gratefully, he has chosen to seek treatment, and he has surrendered finally, and he has a very happy sobriety. He wasn't very happy in his sobriety prior to this, but now he's very happy. He's very grateful, and he's doing great. He called us today. He said he's got a job, and so it's just fabulous. So in all this, what was critically important was throughout this whole time that I was going through the stuff with my son, my wife and I are both in Al-Anon. We engage in the program, we work the steps, work with a sponsor, connect with the program, get the love and support. While all of this instability was going on around me, the love and support showed me that what I need to consider is, even though I feel unstable, I don't need to be unstable. And that the principles of the program, if I maintain fidelity to action on them, that there is stability in that. And even though there was all this stuff going on, I didn't need to lose sight of what my primary purpose was and how to take care of myself and put one foot in front of the other and show both sons unconditional love, which is what we did. And so if my son ended up on the street, we would love him no less, okay? But he chose not to live on the street. And that's where the relationship itself has conditions, okay? But my love for him has no conditions. So what did I learn from all this? All right, what's the great lessons? And this is an Al-Anon, these are the gifts of Al-Anon for me. And these created kind of a transcendent experience in how I now engage in interpersonal relationships, and how the freedom that I've been given as a result of practicing this program and putting forward boundaries. So I've gotten 5 great gifts. One is that others matter, okay? And what it means to engage with others is love. And love is letting others voluntarily evolve. And that is the most important thing I can do for my sons, is allow them to evolve, make whatever choices they need to make whatever mistakes they need to make, be in whatever pain they need to be in to learn. I can't take their pain away from them, as much as sometimes as a parent I want to. But the boundaries forward, it's on them to lead their own lives. And if they need something, then we're here to give it to them. Trying to figure it out, this is number 2, trying to figure it out is the problem. So in other words, we were trying to figure out all the stuff that was going on, and our lives were unmanageable, completely unmanageable, because we're missing the point. And the point is there was nothing to figure out. What was going on was addiction, period. And that what I needed to do to take care of myself, get involved in the program, surrender to a degree I hadn't surrendered before, and then take action on the program. That was that's all I needed to figure out. The rest of it doesn't matter. And that's all I needed. It's all figured out. I just have to take action. I don't have to figure anything out because they're figured out in the boundaries. The boundaries are the practices I need to take in order to maintain my own agency and allow the others around me to have their own agency. The next great gift I've received is a definition of humility is giving people space and time. And so my one son got it like that, got sober immediately, and he's been sober ever since. My other son's taken quite a bit of time to get sober. It's none of my business. That's their journey. Okay, so what I needed to do, and I did a decent job of this, was to give my son, who was struggling, the space and time he needed to sort through this stuff, along with boundaries, for him to recognize that he had certain choices to make in his lives that had consequences, and he got it. The other lesson that I learned that was great was that everything happens in its own time. And one of the most important things I can do is not try to hurry things up, because ultimately, my engagement with my kids, even though things may be ambiguous, even though I may not understand what's going on, seeing them suffering or whatever, my job is not to alleviate my discomfort by trying to fix them. And the boundary is really important reminder that I've got a place where I stop also, okay? And they have a place where they stop. And I have to stop to enforce the boundary. And then the last great gift that I've been given is that grace happens and God's will counts. Grace is always happening, all the time. And so my job is to cooperate with it. Grace is an unmerited gift. And I've been given tremendous gifts in all this. Were you to ask me 2.5 years ago when all this stuff was going down, I wouldn't have in a trillion years have imagined that things have ended up the way that they have. It's unmerited. I get far more than I will ever deserve. And I got to maintain a disposition of gratitude and acceptance for the grace that's being given to me, a manifestation of a love of this higher power, because his will counts. And what he wants us to do is to love and allow others to evolve in our lives. So ultimately, what boundaries teach me is that the best way I can engage my children as a parent is to have a front row seat to their process. And what that means is for me to be a conscious witness of their choice making. They are in control of their lives. And that's what I tell you. You're running the ship, man. How can I support you? Tell me what I can do to support you. And then we figure out the right way that I can do to help them make more informed decisions. But the decision is theirs. And I can't tell them to make one decision or other. I just give them more information and have them have a greater appreciation of consequences. And so they take whatever consequences they want to take. And that's not my journey or my issue at all. So to end, what I'd like to do is just to read a quote regarding all this and how this works and the freedom that having boundaries in a relationship provides and the richness of a relationship that it can provide. The point of these relationships is not to create a quick commonality by tearing down all boundaries. On the contrary, a good relationship is one which each partner appoints the other to be the guardian of his or her solitude, and thus they show each other the greatest possible trust. A merging of two people is an impossibility, and where it seems to exist, it is a hemming in, a mutual consent that robs one or both parties of their fullest freedom and development. But once the realization is accepted that even between the closest people, infinite distances exist, a marvelous living side by side can grow up for them if they succeed in loving the expanse between them, which gives them the possibility of seeing each other as a whole and before an immense sky. The fact of the matter is that with each relationship in my life, there's a gap. There's a gap because we're dealing with two separate entities. And what boundaries teach me what to do is to love the gap, because it's in the gap that I find God, and that I can then see the other as other. Thank you so much for letting me share.